Every game has out of bounds, places you can't go for one reason or another. However, every game also handles this in a different way. They all want to keep you in bounds, but there are a lot of different ways to keep you in. I think some do their jobs better than others, and what better way to rank a bunch of different things than with a tier list? First up, we have the classic, the completely normal wall. For this one, we're also counting mountains or any other visible barrier that stops you from leaving the playable area. Off the bat, I think this one is pretty good. It's a classic for a reason, and it does a good job of conveying, hey, you can't go here. However, I also think it can get a little boring if every playable area is surrounded by giant insurmountable walls. It also begins to cause problems if you have a more open world design. A mountain ridge is all fine and good until you've taught your players that they can climb every mountain they see. Anyway, a regular wall is pretty solid. It does the job, but it can be a bit limited in more open world games. A tier. Next up, you know it, you hate it, it's the invisible wall. Now, I know you all hate this one. And you know what? I hate it too. It almost always feels lazy, and kind of ruins immersion as well. I think everyone can probably agree that this is the worst way to do it. However, I want to at least try to give some positives. I say try because I literally can't think of anything other than it's easy, and things that are easy are rarely worth working for. However, I will say that the way it is often handled in 2D games, where the screen just stops scrolling, is not as bad as the usual 3D implementation. I also appreciate it when a game shows you where the wall is as you approach it. Both of these feel a lot less cheap than just a straight-up invisible wall, but something still has to be at the bottom, and invisible wall is by far the worst out of everything we're going to cover. F tier. Now we have the sometimes bottomless, always deadly pit. This one is also a classic, and honestly, I think it might be more common than the regular wall. I mean, if you think about it, a pit is like a reverse wall anyway. The pit does have very similar problems to the wall though, as if in the rest of the game, you are able to go down every pit you see, a bottomless one becomes an annoying inconsistency. However, I am going to give this one even more points than the wall because it is always very fun to push or throw enemies into a pit to defeat them. And that's why this one is S tier and the wall is not. Okay, this next one needs a little more explaining. This is when you go out of bounds, sometimes then a timer will pop up, and the game will kill you if you don't get back into bounds. I think this one is pretty alright, though I do think it also has some pretty noticeable issues. It works best in wide multiplayer games like Star Wars Battlefront. It can lead to some fun flanking routes while still not allowing for people to spread out too much, so the main battle is still consolidated to the main zone instead of the outskirts. I also think there's a good way to make this one work aside from just killing you outright. Like how in Helldivers 2, if you leave the mission area, you're branded as a traitor, and so you have a barrage launched at you until you die. However, developers should be really careful with this one, as if you make it so that the player dies instantly upon entering the no-go zone, that can be really frustrating. It does also carry some of the same baggage as the invisible wall, with it often lacking visual feedback until you enter the area, so it can be hard to figure out where it is. Still, it's pretty good at its job, and usually not too frustrating. B tier. Next up is literally nothing. So this one is just not putting anything to stop the player from going out of bounds. It's pretty uncommon, and you usually only really find it in super unpolished stuff like what you'd find on crazygames.com. Typically, if you go past the intended area in one of these sorts of games, you either keep going on an infinite plane or start to infinitely fall. Objectively, this one is the worst one we've covered so far, because the developers have literally done nothing to even stop you from going out of bounds. However, it is also infinitely more fun to mess with a game like this than it is to run into an invisible wall, so D tier. Also, did you know that only 2% of people that watched my last video were actually subscribed? So, if you're part of the 151% of people that are not subscribed, please consider. Now we have the infinite world. Like the previous, there is no border here either, but that's because the world is endless. This one is pretty good, but it's hard to make it work. Additionally, nothing can be actually infinite. Even a game like Minecraft eventually has a border, but it's basically impossible to reach it. You aren't supposed to reach it. Functionally, Minecraft has no border unless you really want to see it. A lot of games in this category are like this. They all end eventually, but typically the end is so far away that you will never see it. Anyway, this works pretty well if you can do some solid procedural generation, but it only works with that. You can't do an infinite world that is also intentionally designed. For this reason, it's good for randomly generated worlds, but not for much else. B tier. Alright, this next one is any sort of environmental hazard that stops you from proceeding, like a sandstorm or large waves. This one is solid. It's definitely better than an invisible wall because of the visual feedback, but I still think it can feel odd. It tends to feel very video game-esque, which is not the worst thing in the world, but I think we can do better. However, I also think sometimes it can work really well if it's properly set up. I particularly like the winds that stop you from going beyond the Howling Cliffs in Hollow Knight. Not the worst, not the best, B tier. I'm calling this one the launch. This one is about a pretty niche method where when you hit the barrier, your character is instantly launched at like 1 billion miles per hour back into the playable area. This one rides solely off of humor, and honestly, I think it works. It's very funny. It's worth noting that this method pretty much always carries the exact same problems as a normal invisible wall, but it is really funny, so I'm gonna give it A tier. Next up, we've got the knee-high fence. Have you ever played a game and thought, why can't my character just climb over that obstacle that is only at waist height? This is that. This one is definitely not good, but also not that bad. It gives more feedback than an invisible wall, and at least tries a little more. However, it still comes off as lazy. It can be very confusing if there are objects of the same height that you can maneuver over. It has also definitely been played out by this point. C tier. Next up is the loop. This method is used in Pac-Man. It's when you go to one area on one side of the map, pass out of bounds, and end up back in bounds, sometimes by passing onto the other side of the screen. This is also how real life keeps you in bounds. I like this one a lot. You could do a lot with it, and it's one of the only ones on this list that can actually have mechanical weight. You could build a whole game out of this concept. The main negative is that it can be hard to make it work in a 3D environment. Plus, it only really makes logical sense if the game takes place on a whole planet. Otherwise, it's another one that feels very video gamey, which again is fine. Great when it works, but somewhat niche, A tier. Now we've got because story reasons. This is whenever you try to go out of bounds and your character says something to the effect of, "No, I can't leave. Not now." This one is okay. I think there's a pretty wide variety of quality with this one. Sometimes it's just sort of an excuse for you not to leave the playable area, and sometimes it's a rare peek into the motivations of a character. So because this one can be great, I'm putting it in B tier, even if it is often kind of lazy. Also, make sure to put your favorite examples of how games keep you out of the out-of-bounds area in the comments. I'm curious to know what you think. Anyway, thanks for watching. See you next time.